January 17, 1940. Reichsluftfahrtministerium, Berlin. The polished oak doors of the Reich Air Ministry closed with a muted thud, sealing the winter cold outside. Inside, beneath vaulted ceilings adorned with eagles and swastikas, a group of men in Luftwaffe blue-gray uniforms gathered around a long mahogany table. Maps of Europe sprawled across its surface, marked with red and black lines tracing conquest and consolidation. The air smelled of cigar smoke and confidence. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, watching as intelligence officers presented production estimates from across the Atlantic. America, they reported, had manufactured fewer than 6,000 military aircraft in the previous year. Kesselring permitted himself a thin smile. 6,000, as the Luftwaffe had already surpassed 10,000 operational machines. Outside, through frost-etched windows, the streets of Berlin hummed with the rhythm of a nation convinced of its invincibility. The numbers on paper seemed to confirm what ideology had already promised. Germany possessed not only superior will, but superior means. The Reich's aircraft factories in Dessau, Regensburg, and Augsburg churned out Messerschmitts and Junkers with the precision of Swiss watches. And America? America was an industrial giant, yes, but a sleeping one. Soft, divided, still reeling from economic depression, its military ranked 19th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. The Luftwaffe commanders nodded to one another. If war came with the United States, it would be over before American factories could even retool. They could not have known, yet in that confident winter morning, that they were staring at a mirage. What those men in Berlin failed to understand, what their entire ideological framework rendered invisible, was not a question of machinery or steel, but of systems. The German war economy operated on the assumption that military production was the domain of the state, directed from above, executed by the chosen, constrained by the boundaries of blood and soil. It was an economy of scarcity managed by willpower, of resources hoarded and rationed, of production lines dependent on conquered territories and slave labor. The American economy, by contrast, was something altogether different. Chaotic, decentralized, driven not by decree but by competition and profit, capable of rapid adaptation because it had no single point of control. In 1940, this distinction seemed irrelevant, but by 1944 it would become the hinge upon which the war turned. The story of how America produced 300,000 aircraft in 4 years is not merely a tale of factories and assembly lines. It is the story of a collision between two visions of modernity, one that believed industrial power flowed from the purity of the state, and one that unleashed it through the messy, undirected energy of free enterprise. It is the story of how abundance defeated ideology, how the impossible became routine, and how men who once mocked American softness came to fear the sound of engines in the sky. Before Pearl Harbor, American aviation was fragmented and small. In 1939, the United States possessed fewer than 2,000 frontline military aircraft. The Army Air Corps was an afterthought, its planes outdated, its doctrine untested. Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed existed, but they were minor players compared to Germany's state-backed giants. The American aviation industry employed roughly 63,000 workers. Production was modest, experimental, constrained by peacetime budgets and isolationist politics. Congress had no appetite for war. The public had no stomach for European entanglements, and so the factories idled, producing civilian transports and mail planes, waiting for orders that never came. In Germany, the Luftwaffe had been preparing since 1935. By 1939, it fielded 4,000 combat-ready aircraft and a doctrine of blitzkrieg that married air power to armored spearheads. Goering boasted that the Luftwaffe was invincible. His confidence was not baseless. Over Poland, over France, And over the skies of Britain, German pilots flew machines that were, plane for plane, superior in design and execution to anything the democracies fielded. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 outclassed early Spitfires. The Stuka dive bombers terrorized ground forces with precision, and the industrial base behind them, Messerschmitt AG, Junkers, Heinkel, operated with the efficiency of state control, producing thousands of aircraft annually while the rest of Europe scrambled to catch up. But there was a ceiling to this system, invisible at first. German production relied on skilled craftsmen, on hand-fitted components, on quality over quantity. Each aircraft was a work of precision engineering, assembled by trained workers in factories that could not easily expand. When Albert Speer later became Minister of Armaments, and he would discover that German aircraft production had barely increased between 1940 and 1942, hovering around 15,000 planes per year. The reasons were structural: bottlenecks in aluminum supply, dependence on raw materials from occupied territories, and a leadership that believed wars were won by tactical brilliance, not industrial endurance. America, by contrast, had no such illusions. When President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress in May 1940, as France collapsed and Britain stood alone, he asked for something that sounded absurd: 50,000 aircraft per year. 50,000. Military experts scoffed. Industrialists hesitated. The infrastructure did not exist. The workforce was untrained. The designs were unproven. And yet Roosevelt understood something that the Luftwaffe commanders did not: that American industry was not a static entity, but a dynamic one, capable of transformation at a scale and speed unimaginable to centralized economies. What followed was not a plan, but an explosion. The men who built America's air armada were not soldiers. They were automakers and shipbuilders, tool and die makers and farm boys, women who had never touched a rivet gun, and engineers who had never designed a bomber. They came from Detroit and Los Angeles, from small towns in Kansas and factory floors in Ohio. They came because there were jobs, because there was a paycheck, because the government offered cost-plus contracts that guaranteed profit and minimized risk. And they came because, for the first time in a decade, the factories were hiring. Henry Ford, yet the man who had revolutionized automobile production with the moving assembly line, was persuaded to apply his methods to aircraft. In 1941, Ford broke ground on the Willow Run plant outside Detroit, a structure so vast it would become the largest single-room factory in the world, over 3 million square feet under one roof, with an assembly line stretching more than a mile. The goal was to produce B-24 Liberator bombers, 4-engine heavy bombers weighing 30,000 pounds at a rate of 1 per hour. Critics called it impossible. Aircraft, they said, were not cars. They required precision, customization, hand assembly. Ford ignored them. By 1944, Willow Run was rolling out a Liberator every 63 minutes. Across the country, similar transformations unfolded. Yet Douglas Aircraft expanded its Santa Monica plant and built new facilities in Oklahoma and Chicago. Boeing constructed the largest airplane factory in the world in Renton, Washington, dedicated solely to B-29 Superfortress production. Lockheed's Burbank plant worked around the clock, camouflaged beneath netting painted to resemble suburban neighborhoods, churning out P-38 Lightnings. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, North American Aviation in Kansas City, Republic Aviation on Long Island. Each became a city unto itself, employing tens of thousands, operating in shifts that never stopped. But the factories were only part of the equation. The supply chain required aluminum, rubber, and steel in quantities that strained every resource. Aluminum production alone tripled between 1940 and 1943, and driven by massive government investment in smelters powered by hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest. Rubber, cut off from Southeast Asian plantations by Japanese conquest was synthesized domestically in chemical plants that had not existed 2 years earlier. Steel mills operated at 100% capacity, feeding material into a production machine that consumed more resources in a month than some nations used in a year. And the workers, by 1943, the American aviation industry employed over 2 million people. Half of them were women. Rosie the Riveter was not a metaphor. She was a statistical reality. Women who had been secretaries, school teachers, and homemakers learned to operate hydraulic presses, install wiring harnesses, and buck rivets in fuselage sections. They worked 10-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and in factories that roared with the sound of hammers and drills, where sparks from welding torches lit the darkness like fireflies. The turnover was high, the training minimal, but the output was relentless. In 1943 alone, American factories produced 85,000 aircraft. In 1944, the number reached 96,000. To put this in perspective, in the entire war, from 1939 to 1945, Germany produced approximately 119,000 aircraft. America exceeded that number in less than 2 years of peak production. The Luftwaffe commanders did not grasp this reality until it was too late. Intelligence reports filtered back from occupied Europe, from agents in neutral countries, from reconnaissance flights over Allied airfields. The numbers seemed inflated, impossible, the product of Allied propaganda. Surely, if the reports were exaggerated, surely the Americans were counting trainers, transports, obsolete biplanes. Surely no industrial system could sustain such output. But the skies over Europe told a different story. In 1942, when the 8th Air Force began daylight bombing raids over occupied France, the formations were small, dozens of bombers escorted by a handful of fighters. Luftwaffe pilots shot them down with relative ease, confident in their experience and superior tactics. But by 1943, the formations grew. 100 bombers became 300, 300 became 600, and behind them came waves of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, long-range fighters that could escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Oberstleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace with over 100 kills, had described the feeling in his post-war memoir. We could shoot down 10 bombers, 20, 50, and still they came. For every one we destroyed, 2 more appeared. It was like fighting the ocean. You could drown 100 men and the tide would still rise. The German fighter pilots were among the best in the world. They had experience, training, and aircraft that, in skilled hands, could still outmaneuver American planes, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and, most crucially, unsupported by an industrial base that could replace losses. By 1944, a German pilot might fly 3, 4, 5 sorties in a single day, scrambling from improvised airstrips as Allied bombers pounded factories and fuel depots. There was no rotation, no rest, no replacement aircraft waiting in reserve. When a Messerschmitt went down, it was gone. Just when an American P-51 went down, 3 more arrived the next week. Generalfeldmarschall Erhard Milch, who oversaw Luftwaffe production, visited the Eastern Front in late 1943 and returned to Berlin pale and shaken. He met with Göring and laid out the figures. Germany was producing 1,500 fighters per month. America was producing 8,000 aircraft per month across all categories. "We are not fighting an air force," Milch said. "We are fighting an industrial system that has no limit." Göring, ever the optimist, dismissed the numbers. "Impossible," he said. "The Americans are a mongrel race. They lack discipline. They cannot sustain this." But the factory floors in Detroit and Burbank did not care about ideology. They cared about quotas, bonuses, and the rhythm of the assembly line. There was a symbolic object that came to represent this abundance, not in the cockpit or the factory, but in the mess halls and briefing rooms where American airmen gathered before missions. It was simple, ubiquitous, almost absurd in its ordinariness. The candy bar. German pilots flew on black bread and ersatz coffee, their rations dwindling as the war ground on. By 1944, even basic foods were scarce in the Reich. Meat was a memory. Butter, a luxury. The Luftwaffe, stretched across multiple fronts, could not guarantee hot meals for its pilots, let alone comfort or rest. They flew hungry, exhausted, watching their comrades die in burning cockpits, knowing that tomorrow they would fly again because there was no one else. American pilots, by contrast, flew with Hershey bars in their flight suits, and they ate steak and eggs before dawn missions. They drank real coffee, smoked Lucky Strikes, and returned from bombing runs to bases where hot showers and clean bunks waited. When they were shot down over Germany and captured, they carried emergency rations that included chocolate, canned meat, and chewing gum. Luftwaffe soldiers who searched them found more food in a single survival kit than they had seen in a week. The candy bar was not a weapon, but it was a message. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to give our soldiers sweets." It said, "Our factories produce not only bombers and bullets, but also abundance in every form." It said, "This war is already over, because you are fighting scarcity, and we are fighting from surplus." Captured German pilots interrogated in Allied prison camps. They often expressed disbelief not at American tactics or bravery, but at American logistics. One Luftwaffe officer, interviewed after the war, recalled the moment he realized Germany had lost. "It was not when I was shot down. It was when I was given a meal in the POW camp, and it was better than anything I had eaten in 2 years of service. I thought, if they can feed prisoners this well, what are they feeding their soldiers?" Abundance was ideology made manifest. Democracy, messy and inefficient in peacetime, became an engine of production in war. The decentralized, profit-driven, competitive chaos of American capitalism, mocked by fascists as weak and decadent, proved capable of feats that centralized planning could never match. It was not because Americans were braver or smarter, it was because the system itself rewarded innovation, absorbed failure, and scaled success without requiring permission from above. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shadow force. Its pilots were teenagers with 20 hours of training, flying planes that had no fuel, scrambling from autobahns because the airfields were cratered. The factories that had produced the Bf-109 and the FW-190 lay in ruins, bombed into rubble by the very aircraft they had once dismissed as inferior. In the Pacific, the story was the same. Japanese pilots who had begun the war with superior training and aircraft found themselves overwhelmed by waves of American planes, Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, flown by pilots who rotated out after a set number of missions, rested, retrained, and returned. Hence, the Japanese could not replace their losses. Every experienced pilot killed was a permanent loss. America replaced losses and added more. By 1945, a single American aircraft carrier launched more planes in a day than the entire Japanese Naval Air Force could muster. In the final accounting, the numbers were staggering. From 1940 to 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft. Germany produced 119,000. Japan produced 76,000. Britain, fighting from the beginning, managed 131,000. The Soviet Union, despite catastrophic losses, produced 157,000. But raw numbers do not capture the psychological weight of this disparity. To be a German or Japanese soldier in 1944, looking up at the sky, was to experience a kind of existential dread. The sound of engines, distant at first, then growing, then omnipresent, became the soundtrack of defeat. It meant that somewhere, in a country they had been told was weak and cowardly, factories were running day and night, producing machines faster than they could be destroyed. It meant that the ideology they had been fed, that willpower and racial purity determined victory, was a lie. It meant that the war was lost, and had been lost perhaps before it even began. Generaloberst Hans Jesenek, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, committed suicide in August 1943. He left no note, but his adjutants knew why. He had seen the production figures. He had seen the attrition rates. And he had realized that no amount of tactical genius or battlefield courage could overcome an enemy that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, wrote with bitter clarity, "We lost the war in the factories. Every battle, every campaign, was merely the slow unfolding of a conclusion already determined by industrial capacity. We were fighting arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care about ideology." But there is a deeper lesson in this story, one that transcends production numbers and strategic analysis. The 300,000 aircraft were not merely machines. They were the physical embodiment of a choice about how societies organize themselves, about what they value, and about what they are willing to become in the face of existential threat. Yet the totalitarian powers believed that strength came from unity imposed from above, from the elimination of dissent, from the harnessing of the nation's will into a single, directed force. They believed that democracy was weakness, that freedom was inefficiency, that the chaotic, argumentative, pluralistic societies of the West could never match the disciplined might of the Reich or the Empire of Japan. They were wrong. What they failed to understand was that freedom and abundance are not separate things. Freedom produces abundance because it unleashes human creativity in 1,000 directions at once, allowing failures to die and successes to scale without waiting for permission from a central authority. The American industrial mobilization was chaotic, wasteful, and often inefficient. Contracts were awarded on political grounds. Factories competed with each other for resources. Labor strikes disrupted production. Corruption was rampant. And yet the system worked, not despite these flaws, but because of them. Because the incentive to succeed was distributed across millions of individuals. Because profit and competition drove innovation. Because failure in one factory did not doom the entire enterprise. The Luftwaffe commanders, sitting in Berlin in January 1940, could not see this. They saw only the surface, a nation that seemed divided, uncertain, unprepared. They could not imagine that within 4 years, that nation would be producing more aircraft in a month than Germany produced in a year. And when the realization finally came, when the skies darkened with Allied bombers and the factories lay in ruins, it was too late. The war ended in May 1945. The factories that had produced 300,000 aircraft began to shut down. Workers returned to civilian life. The assembly lines that had rolled out B-24s and P-51s were retooled to produce cars and refrigerators. The great industrial mobilization, perhaps the most astonishing feat of production in human history, faded into memory. But the aircraft remained. They sat in desert boneyards, row upon row of aluminum and steel stretching to the horizon. Thousands of them, surplus to need, relics of a war that had been won not by valor alone, but by the relentless, unstoppable force of abundance. And in the quiet of those boneyards, under the desert sun, there was a truth that the Luftwaffe commanders had learned too late: that freedom and industry are not opposites, but partners. That democracy, for all its inefficiencies, it possesses a hidden strength, an ability to mobilize not just bodies, but belief. That when free people choose to fight, they do not merely fight with what they have. They create what they need. The 300,000 aircraft were not just a number, they were a statement. They said, "We can outbuild you. We can outlast you. We can turn our factories into fortresses and our workers into warriors. And when the war is over, we will turn them back again, because that is what free societies do. The Luftwaffe commanders could not believe it, even as the evidence fell from the sky. But belief, in the end, was irrelevant. The engines roared, the factories ran, and the war was won.